sent a text to our family asking us to sign a petition to, and I'm quoting here from the petition, abolish anti-Semitism at the City University of New York. Now, when you read the petition, what it indicated was that the City University of New York Student Senate is going to vote on whether or not to adopt a resolution supporting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And the petition goes on and says, certain campus groups are seeking to delegitimize this definition by spreading misinformation about the resolution. Students for Justice in Palestine has gone so far as to create a reactive resolution which strongly condemns the resolution. So, support those Jewish students and you will abolish anti-Semitism at CUNY, suggests the petition. As the person who's more responsible for having actually penned much of the words in the IHRA definition, but who opposes some of the ways in which it is being used, can you tell my niece, who I think is listening, what you think of this petition, and maybe start with a little history of the definition, because not everybody may be familiar with the terms of it.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Thank you for hosting me, and I look forward to a great conversation. And tell your niece if she wants to talk afterwards and call me up or whatever. I'm happy to have a further conversation with her directly. So one of the ways I think about bigotry, including anti-Semitism, and working on this since the 1980s, is it's always good to sort of cut and paste a scenario and see if the same rules apply. So as I'm answering your question, think about this. If there were a group of black students today in the aftermath of George Floyd and everything else that said, we want a school to adopt a particular definition of racism. And it had certain examples that could be indicia of racism. For example, opposition to affirmative action, desiring to keep Confederate statues in place, and so forth. And then you wanted to have that adopted as the official policy of a university. What does that tell you about what discourse happens on a university? A university, to me, is a place where ideas should be examined. They should be examined thoroughly. People should, battle back and forth on ideas, but people should be able to be disturbed by ideas and then to argue back to them. I sent two kids to college not that long ago. They're both in their 20s. If they weren't disturbed by ideas and didn't figure out how to think about them, I would have wasted a lot of money. And I worry about the tendency, and I see this outside of the Israel context, and on the right and the left, to sort of say, okay, here's the pure way to think. And what that does is it promotes this idea of groupthink rather than individual agency. I think students need to be in a place where they can experiment with ideas and be wrong. And if they're wrong, other people can push back at them. But to have a particular prescribed view of what it's okay to say and what isn't is a problem to me. It goes to the heart of what the academy is about and undercuts it. That's it, just a quick background to answer your question directly about the definition. So when the peace process collapsed in the early 2000s and we had the second intifada, there was an uptick in attacks against Jews globally, but in Europe in particular. And there was a group called the EUMC that was tasked with monitoring things like this. And it put out a report that had a couple of points that struck me. One is it said correctly, we have different people in different parts of Europe that are tasked with monitoring things, and we have no common definition. So we don't know if they're looking at the same thing. And how do we compare without giving some guidance of what to include and what to exclude? And then the second thing that it did, it said, well, we're going to have a temporary definition, and they looked at anti-Semitism as a series of stereotypes about Jews. And to me, that's backwards, because those stereotypes are reflections of what anti-Semitism is. But leaving aside that philosophical point, what I thought they were trying to do was to say that if a Jew was attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli if the attacker had certain ideas about Jews, applied them to Israelis and then reapplied them to the poor guy who happened to be on the streets of London or Paris or Bratislava or whatever, that was anti-Semitism. But if somebody was upset with Israeli policy and beat them up, that was lamentable, but not to be counted as anti-Semitism. And that struck me as somebody who'd grown up, in the civil rights movement. A black person is attacked because somebody has these stereotypes about blacks. That's racism. But if somebody's upset at the Civil Rights Act passing or something else, that's not racism. So it just so happened that the person who was the director of the EUMC was coming to an American Jewish Committee meeting, an annual meeting. And shortly beforehand, there was an attack on a Montreal Jewish day school in retaliation for Israel assassinating a Hamas leader. Not anti-Semitism to be counted according to their definition. So I worked with colleagues, including my colleague Andy Baker, who did the most of the politicking, and I did the drafting along with other experts, but I did the bulk of the drafting and got consensus of all these different experts. And the idea was to create this document that would be useful primarily for data collectors, also for law enforcement, for a couple of other purposes, but basically to give some guidance. What's contentious about it is that it has a number of things about Israel in it, because we thought it was important, because we saw a correlation, not to say there was causation, but we saw correlation between the uptick in mentions about Israel, including mentions attacking, Zionism in the press, and that correlated with the increase of incidents. So we didn't do it in a way to say that any particular incident should be seen as committed by an anti-Semite, not to label anybody. It was to keep temperature across time and across borders. The problem began, in my view, in 2010, and I document a lot of this in the book. What happened was, in the US, and again, it gets back to the campus, there was a what's called the Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education that said Title VI, which is the civil rights law about educational opportunities, and you can't have discrimination and intimidation and harassment to the extent it creates a pervasively hostile environment. It didn't have religion as a character, as a group that that was protected. It was race and so forth. But the letter in 2010 said that the Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities were protected. Not that that was a great thing. I was actually a complainant for a group of high school students in upstate New York who were kicked, and there was a kick at Jew Day and pennies thrown at them and all that stuff. And the school district did nothing, and here we had a great tool, right? So I was all in favor of that. But what happened is some groups on the Jewish right said, aha, let's take this definition, marry it to this new tool that can threaten the entire funding of an educational institution, and say if professors are teaching things that violate the definition, if speakers are coming in, that those types of things that they thought violated the definition, some were saying boycott, divestment, and sanctions violated it too, that could be used as part of a basis for Title VI case. And that's where this debate changed. In 2016, IRA, the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, adopted the definition and set out to try to get as many places to adopt it as possible. And it's become in some ways the holy grail, but what it does, in my view, to misapply it this way, is to take away the entire discussion of how do we understand anti-Semitism, what do we do about anti-Semitism. Has become a black and white issue of, do we accept this definition and apply it, especially to stigmatize anti-Zionism, which I could talk about a little bit more because I'm sure you'll ask me about that, or not. And that should not be the parameters of how we discuss about what to do about anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. And I want to remind everybody, as you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A, and we'll thread them in throughout the talk today. The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine campus debate, is the book we're talking about right now. If you're local to Memphis, you can purchase it at Novel. Otherwise, it can be purchased on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, places like that. So get yourself a copy. Ken, you mentioned in your book a situation in which a couple of panelists from opposing sides of this Israel-Palestine debate refused to participate with one another, right, for an event. Like they literally refused to sit with each other, and not only sit with each other, but to participate with one another at all. And you also mentioned a student who asked the question, who gets to decide that you don't have to listen to another person? You don't have to share space with another person. In my experience, it's not always an option to opt out of a difficult conversation or sharing space with someone you don't want to share space with. How important is it to sit and engage with those whom we vehemently disagree with? And how do we begin to be open enough to have these difficult conversations?
Thank you. And I was there in the room when that happened. I was so proud of that student. I thought she was a lot wiser than some of the adults. It's tough, especially when you have a contentious issue like this. And, as you know, in the book, I spend the first chapter really diving into what we know from the emerging field of hate studies about why our thinking gets affected when our identity is connected to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice. We try to make things more black and white. We try to simplify them. We try to categorize them in a way that we really don't have to think about them. We reject the complexity of them. So that's just human nature in terms of how we think about things like this, especially when they get into our guts, right? So in that environment, when you think you have all justice on one side, and the other side is standing for something that's unjust, then the question is, how do you bridge that divide? And it's obviously not always an easy thing to do. And I have examples in the book where each side, pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel, are so zealous about their views that they actually refer to the other side as Nazis. And you don't sit down and have, tea and cake with Nazis. So that's how they view it, and it becomes a purity thing. I think there are lots of ways to break that down. That's part of the reason why I actually started the book and ended the book with a story outside the campus, where in Spokane, Washington, where some of you may, actually I wrote, the book like a little over a year ago. Recently, there was an attack on the synagogue there, by white supremacists. So it's a continual problem there that they have in that community. They had the Aryan nations there for many years. They had somebody trying to set off an explosive on a Martin Luther King Day parade. I mean, it's been a real problem, but because the two groups that really worked together well back in the heydays of the Aryan nations, the Jewish community and the Peace and Justice group, they couldn't sit down and talk to each other because the Peace and Justice group had a static page on its website supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Jewish group was calling them anti-Semites. And they had enough people there to say, this is ridiculous. We're not going to be able to solve what's happening in Israel and Palestine by what's happening in Spokane, but there may be somebody across the street who's planning to harm us or one of our kids or one of our neighbors, and what are we going to do about it? So there was a way, to bring together people, to create a common vocabulary, to talk about how do you disagree, but do it in a way that's respectable, and people learned a lot. I mean, that's one of the laments I have about how this whole debate is happening, not only on campus but outside too. People just are listening to themselves. They're listening. We get it on other things, whether we're in the Fox News versus MSNBC. We're more and more in our buckets, and on this issue too, we aren't really craving. Okay, how would I think if I were born into a different circumstance? And I think that's what education should be about. You should teach children to have that imagination about, if I weren't me, but I was somebody else, that functional empathy. And there are ways to do that with classes. I have other examples in the last chapter in the book about a blueprint of how to do that. I think, one of the underlying things that a campus ought to do, and it's again larger than this issue, is to reemphasize in as many ways as it can that students are there to be with each other, to learn from each other, to be able to be wrong, and to have their thinking shaken, as opposed to be fundamentally, pure and right. You're muted,
There's
John.
you're muted.
I want to follow up on that. And then there's a really good question in the chat as well that I want to get to right afterwards. But just to sort of broaden this back out from Spokane and specific incidents, you have a chapter that's titled Stopping and Chilling Speech, Heckler Veto Legal Threats. And I emphasize the chapter title because in a way it summarizes what you discuss in the chapter. Can you talk us through the different approaches that pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel groups use to stop and chill speech, and give us some examples?
Sure. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that I saw both sides trying to weaponize the university and to chill speech on the other side by different methods. But they were both fundamentally harming what the academy should be about. And, each of them was taking the stance, academic freedom is important, but it's more important to fight anti-Semitism as they understood it, or it's more important to promote pro-Palestinian, justice. And the ways that they do it differ. Students, pro-Palestinian students, have from time to time disrupted speeches, most famously the one by Michael Oren in Irvine. And so how could you let somebody like this speak? We're going to stop them from speaking. Now, there are people that suggest that's ubiquitous. It's not. I have the data in the book. I mean, it's really just a small number of incidents. I think there were 16 total between 2010 and 2019 where a speaker wasn't able to, to do that, to finish a speech. So that's one of the, the major ways. The other thing that I find really reprehensible, and it's actually in a different part of the book, but it ties in, just as well, is the idea of academic boycotts of Israelis. The whole point of the academy is you look at ideas. The nationality or the associations of the nation that the person is from as a scholar should not drive how we think about his or her ideas. But trying to say, okay, Israeli academic institutions are, should be separated from the community of scholars. That's something that I find absolutely deplorable. Thank goodness we've been able to push back on those efforts, but those are problematic. On the other side, what I've seen, is some attempts to put pressure on universities, but most troubling to me is the question of using law. And that's why I testified against the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was an attempt to use the definition to say when the Department of Education or Department of Justice considers a Title VI case, it has to reference, it has to consider the definition as part of its case. What that does is it tells administrators that they either have to speak out against pro-Palestinian speech that somebody may think violates this definition, or suppress that speech because their job is to protect the university from being sued. So it sets up a chilling effect, and it's governmentally sponsored. It's, again, to go back to the example that I used at the beginning, if you'd have a trouble with the government adopting an official definition that said opposing affirmative action is racism, full stop, you should have a problem with adopting a definition that says anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, full stop.
Right. So there's a question here that is from an anonymous attendee, but that kind of pushes back at your own position in terms of speaking about these issues. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think that it's a really important question. What limitations of your research can you acknowledge as a self-proclaimed Zionist writing about the perspective and plight of Palestinians? I think it's very dangerous to position your work as an unbiased and objective understanding of the conflict. That's effectively what he's saying. Can you talk a little bit more about why you are perhaps well positioned to talk about the issues that you're talking about in the book.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. I don't pretend to not have a point of view. I don't think anybody is unbiased, especially about contentious issues like this. My point is that each side has the capacity to point to justice and history. Each side has the capacity to talk about a narrative that's very important to identity. And I try to, as fairly as possible, lay out those different positions in the book. And one of the things, I shared it with a lot of different people, including Palestinians and academics who have a very strong pro-Palestinian stance. And one person who was particularly insightful read an early draft of the chapter where I laid out the sort of traditional Zionist narrative of the connection to Israel and the whole history of it, and why for Judaism Israel is such an important place, and then the Palestinian narrative. And the person's comment on the draft was, it says something where you start. And do you start with the Palestinian narrative or do you start with the Zionist narrative? And I thought about it, and I thought that she was right, and I decided, for a variety of reasons, I'm starting with the Zionist narrative. But I have a long footnote at the end that just said, if you saw the world this way as a Jewish person who was Zionist, how would you have felt if I had started the chapter with the Palestinian narrative and brought in Jews as secondary characters that were mostly seen in opposition to what you were trying to achieve in your own national self-expression? And that's the conundrum. The idea is that you need on a campus to explore both sets of these things. I'll give you another example too that I have in the book. I cite the Iroquois Confederacy, and I used to be a trial lawyer for people that were connected with the Iroquois Confederacy when I represented some American Indian movement folks. And they sent a letter to the Palestinian, or actually they had a letter sent to them by the Palestinian Association for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, saying, we know you guys love lacrosse, it's an important national game for you. The international championships are in Israel. Don't come. You're like us. You've been dispossessed by these white Europeans. You've had your culture stolen. It's a traitor to other indigenous people to come and participate. Please don't. Then I follow that with a passage from Judea Pearl, Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was assassinated by terrorists. He's a scholar at UCLA. And his point was, for those who say Israel is a settler colonial enterprise, name another place where people were coming to a place that's part of their national folklore for thousands of years, celebrated in poetry and so forth. Name another place where people are coming and speaking a language spoken before the current inhabitants. Name another place where colonialists come in and don't name places like New York and New Berlin and New Warsaw, but names that they were known in biblical times and so forth. And I quote another scholar from the UK who basically says that the idea of history is to navigate all this complexity simultaneously. And anything that just takes one or the other is communal advocacy, not education.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. And I also want to take a minute to thank the attendee for asking that question. The whole point of this conversation is to wrestle with the conversation itself, is to wrestle with the ideas themselves and have the just have the difficult conversation. So if you have a conversation, if you have a question that you're wrestling with right now, something that you don't agree with within this conversation, something that you have questions about, you might be nervous to ask because it's complicated and it's complex, and we are so we have such feeling and emotion and passion around these issues. I invite you to ask it if you're comfortable. We're comfortable with you asking, so I just want to put that out there. We're comfortable with the questions if you're comfortable with asking them. So let's see. The next question I want to ask you, Ken. Sorry, I've got to minimize this real quick. where do you see the line? This is a little bit more specific. Where do you see the line between being critical of the Israeli government and anti-Semitism, and then conversely, where do you see the line in being critical of the Palestinian voices as being, racist or colonist?
Well, it's interesting. I'm working on a new piece about lines, and that's part of what I'm, concluding what the book seems to suggest, especially in the beginning chapters, is that we like lines. We like to think, okay, is this something that's, to put it in the Jewish context, tray for kosher? Is this something that's okay or not? And anti-Semitism, like racism, it isn't like a total one or the other. It's not like it's not like pregnancy. You are, you aren't, right? There are ways of managing. So there are certain things I think one can clearly say, are anti-Semitic in terms of anti-Zionism. Holding all Jews collectively responsible for actions of Israel, using classic anti-Semitic tropes and just cutting and pasting Israel for Jews. I mean, and some of that are, in the definition, and that's right. The problem is that for Palestinians, or for many Palestinians, the idea of Zionism is something that's been a total opposition to their capacity for national self-expression. And Jews can, I have, in the piece I'm working on, I show the map that the Israel Foreign Ministry shows of tiny Israel surrounded by all these Arab and Muslim states, which is true, and then a map showing, which is mostly true, of the expanding Israeli control over the land of Israel, including the West Bank, and the dispossession and displacement of people. And so the questioning of Zionism, from that perspective, even though it makes me very uncomfortable, and because I'm a committed Zionist, I understand that if I were born in that different situation, I'd have a different view. There's a piece that when I did that Spokane group and other ones I've done on campus, I used from Derek Penzlar, who teaches at Jewish Studies at Harvard, which is a what-if issue. And it was a sort of what if, instead of Jews coming back to the land of Israel, it were the Templars, which were a Protestant group that also had a connection to the land. And what if they had basically taken over? What would the reaction have been? And it's an interesting exercise, because the question when you're thinking about anti-Semitism is it the opposition because this is Jewish, or is it because people that have a national aspiration and desire for self-determination feel that this group has thwarted them? And that's where it becomes murky. And so I don't think that, there are bright lines there. I think there are things to consider. And that's part of the challenge, again, with the abuse of the definition. Some of the things that reflect anti-Zionism, I think, are important if you're trying to look at the temperature, the climate. But if you're trying to prescribe what's okay and what's not okay to say on a campus, that's an entirely different matter.
So I want to pick this up with a question that's been asked by another one, somebody else that wrote in anonymously. And she writes, how do you ask college, he or she, I'm not sure, but how do you ask college students to be open-minded when many of their professors are not? Many are afraid. Of course, I'm a college professor, so I know lots of these people, and I happen to think most are, but that's okay. Many are afraid of speaking out of fear of repercussions by the professor. What are the kids whose professors refuse to sign their forms to study in Israel? I think she's referring to the incident at University of Michigan, or who teach terrible and untrue things about Israel supposed to do in situations like this. And how are we as Jews supposed to feel when the university stands with the professor? And in responding to that, I'm going to ask you as well to sort of take a step back. And you mentioned like one statistic about what's actually going on college campuses. Can you put her question within a broader frame about like how pressing and heated and vexed are these issues on college campuses in light of the actual data we've got about what's going on?
Thank you. So I'll answer the second part first. There are approximately 4,000 campuses in the United States. Israel is a burning issue in very few. There are annually about twice as many pro-Israel events on campuses than anti-Israel ones. It's a small number, again, of petitions about divestment. Again, the first divestment petition came in February 2002. So that's, 19 years plus. 0 colleges have divested, none will. So that's the context. There are issues, there are burning issues on some campuses, but it's not ubiquitous. The question about the teacher is an important one, but I think it's, the way we should look at it is who's a bad teacher. I was part of a group that signed a letter about precisely that incident of a professor that said, and the full story was he signed a letter for a student saying to study in Israel. Then he realized, oops, it's in Israel. I have a philosophical, political objection to that. I'm not going to do it. You can study elsewhere. I'll write you, but not for that one. To me, that's a bad teacher. What your obligation as a teacher is to help your students, not to substitute your political purity for their options. You might want to say, well, here are the things you might want to consider when you're going there. But if you think it's a qualified student to do it, you do it. If you don't, you don't. And the school came down on that as well. And I think that there's the AAUP and others see that as well. That it's a question of teaching. There have been instances where, at least at Columbia, and I document some of this in the book, and some I documented a little bit more deeply in a prior book, where there were allegations that a professor was, treating students different. To me, that's bad teaching, and the school ought to go after that. When I teach, somebody was talking about my bias. I teach a class on anti-Semitism, and obviously we talk at some point about Zionism and Israel and so forth. And I say to students, I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm a Zionist, but I want to hear what you think. And the only way that I know you're going to get a bad grade in my class is to parrot back to me what you think I think. That I don't want to hear. You have to give students the freedom to explore ideas, and they have to put evidence for it. But your idea is not to proselytize. And I'm seeing with great distress, again, it's not just Israel-Palestine, I'm seeing pushes to vilify faculty. I'm concerned about it, from both the right and the left. To pick out things out of thin air, say somebody's a racist, to not allow people to speak, to deny people jobs. That to me, is a problem when you get to the purity of things on campus. What you want to do is encourage faculty and others to be supportive of different points of view, and to encourage their students to do that. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the tone of the administration, the statements of the president, what the provost and dean do, whether they do surveys about how students feel about life on campus and so forth. So there are lots of ways to deal with it. But in the context of that issue, it's not a question of do you have a particular view of Israel or not. It's a question, are you a bad teacher or not? And we should, call out bad teaching for what it is.
I appreciate that. I was a teacher, but I taught middle school, so it's a little bit different. We have a question in the chat that I do want to get to. The question is, it seems to me the irony on this point is that fusing or identifying Jews with Israel is that both anti-Semites and many Zionists are guilty of that, right? Conflating Jews with Israel. Both anti-Semites and Zionists are guilty of that. That is, Zionists and anti-Semites have often agreed with a variety of issues. How do you parse this?
Well, this is one of the big debates, is really the relationship between Jews and Israel and whether that forms part of Jewish identity. I think that's part of the contentiousness in the debate, over the definition. I looked at that petition that Jonathan mentioned, CUNY, and it ends saying basically, Jews, like everybody else, have a right to define the bigotry against them. Well, excuse me, Jews have lots of differences of opinion about not only, the bigotry, about what anti-Semitism is, but where anti-Zionism is. There are people who are Jewish scholars, Peter Beinart, for example, I may disagree with him on his thinking about what should happen with a joint state and so forth. I think that's a prescription for perpetual conflict, but I don't think it comes from anti-Semitism. It comes from a different view of what's the best thing forward. And there's this conflation on both sides. I mean, sometimes the Israeli government takes a stance and says, we're speaking for Jews globally, and Jews are as mixed as everybody else. And sometimes in the Jewish community says, my position stands for everything in the in the Jewish world. We're not. We're having, and that's part of, again, the problem to me when I was testifying in front of the Judiciary Committee on the question of the institutionalizing of the definition. To declare that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is in effect stating that the relationship between Jews and Israel is monolithic, and you want the state to decide that internal debate. And I don't know how that debate gets decided, but I'm really worried when people say we want the state to decide that for us.
So just quick shout out about the last questioner was Shaul Magid, a leading a Jewish studies scholar. I want to ask the question that Sarah Siegel wrote to us. Is the phenomenon of preventing controversial speakers to present their ideas on campus unique to US campuses, or is it also now common in Israel, Europe, Asia, Africa, globally? And then she asked, what will it take to get to return to the days when controversial speakers are freely able to present their ideas on campus, or was there ever such an era?
It's a great question, and I don't propose that I'm an expert on the academy in every part of the world. I can tell you from talking to colleagues in the UK, it's gotten harder to bring some controversial speakers there than before. And in the US, there have been instances. That's part of the challenge, again, on the issue of the anti-Semitism stuff. Is it when you have people that are saying that Steve Bannon shouldn't be allowed to speak, or Milo, or Ann Coulter, or Charles Murray, because they're all seen as conservatives, is part of the problem with the pro-Israel speakers because they're Jews, or because Israel is seen as a conservative issue. So that's a little part of that debate as well. But I think again, to me, the idea of getting the college to endorse the idea that we want to bring controversial speakers in, not just for the sake of yucks, but for the sake of exposing. If there are people that are following hateful ideas, and you don't give the students an opportunity to see them firsthand. I mean, all of us who went to college remember primary sources. Well, an invitation does not imply endorsement. And I have in the book about when Ahmadinejad came to Columbia, and that was a big contentious thing. But the university handled it right. It didn't just say, okay, we're going to have him come. Bollinger planned it, and it turned out to be a disaster for Ahmadinejad. He got parodied on Saturday Night Live and a cover of the New Yorker for what he said there. I was involved years ago at HAC with a question at a university when a Ku Klux Klan leader was going to be invited in. It was a big uproar, and we can't allow this to happen. And the event actually happened, but off the campus. And what was the reason that this person was being invited? It was a journalism class. And what was the reason the journalism class wanted this Ku Klux Klan guy in? So that journalism students could figure out, how do you interview a white supremacist? And I could tell you, from having worked against David Duke for a lot of years, when he was running for various offices, the press didn't have a clue. They would ask him, "Are you a racist?" He said, "No, I'm not anymore." And they would move on to the next question. Having the capacity to think, okay, our job here at a university is to figure out how to think about these things and bring in these ideas and hear them firsthand, I think is important. So I think the more the universities, okay, happy to say at Bard, which isn't perfect, but I have a colleague that runs the Hannah Arendt Center, and part of what he does is called Tough Talks. He brings in people to not only to engage with students and faculty, but to underscore that this is what a liberal arts education should be about. So I think the more we have that type of push, the better off we're going to be.
We've got a comment / question that I want to get to in the Q&A, and it's by an anonymous attendee, and I think it's important. This voice, it says, "Well, I appreciate this conversation. I feel as though it is heavily one-sided, it is a heavily one-sided conversation that, in my opinion, has only discussed the struggles that Jewish/Israeli students face with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been used as a weapon against pro-Palestinian students in an effort to silence them. What does the speaker have to say about the censorship of Palestinian students' voices that accusations of anti-Semitism causes?"
I think that's a great question. And I actually have a lot of that in the book. And it's one of the things that deeply troubles me, because as one of the reviewers of the book said, and I think he's right, he said one of the problems with creating a tool for finding witches is, you're going to see witch hunts. And I think that that's what the definition has been used for in lots of ways. I have a documented in the book this group Canary Mission, which a lot of people in the Federation supported. I know some other people who in the Jewish community support. I find it deplorable. It's a group that basically said, we're going to sort of look for what mostly students that are pro-Palestinian are saying. Are they supporting boycotts? Are they saying other things that we find objectionable? And we're going to start a blacklist. And our blacklist is going to be there so these folks never get employed. What a horrible thing. I mean, the academic boycott is a blacklist. You don't fight it with a blacklist, especially of teenagers. Who of us would want to, be responsible for what we thought is 17 or 18 or 19 if somebody could, fish it out and take it out of context. So it has been used, and that's part of the challenge. And one of the challenges I've had with colleagues in the Jewish community, and this is global, is they tend to think of the question about the definition as narrow. How is it going to be used legally? And I'm much more concerned with the chilling effect. I'm concerned about, if somebody wants to put on a Palestinian film festival, is a group going to say, well, there are things in the films that violate the definition? And I have seen that. And one of the things that I'm, writing about is there was a challenge, some of you may recall, with a Jewish student in California who was sort of kicked out of student government with lots of anti-Zionist and other, harassment against her, which was deplorable. But very few people have talked about, there was a Palestinian student at the same time in Florida who had grown up in the West Bank, had said something when he was 12 on social media that he apologized for about Jews, but one could understand in the context of where he was and what was going on and what he was seeing. He was identifying Israelis with Jews, and then they tried to strip him out of the student government position, and you actually had local, officials, government officials, calling for the kid to be removed. So, and that got a lot less attention. So I think it happens in both ways, and I'm really thankful for the, for the question on that. And I do have a lot of that in the book too.
As I read deeper and deeper into your book, Ken, one of the takeaways for me is that Israeli people who support Israel or Zionism and people who support the Palestinian cause, both sides have two inherently irreconcilable narratives. And in the course of both of their narratives now, both sides claim about the other that their narrative is racist.
Mm-hmm.
And if their narrative is racist, it's inherently the case that we ought not to hear that racist narrative and to be confronted with it. And that is what is leading to the shutdown on both sides about this issue. That was the biggest takeaway I came away from in the book. And I'll just use that to segue into a question from one of my students who I love dearly. She's absolutely fabulous. Her name's Mariam Kayada, and she asked the following question: what is your opinion on student group efforts to get their institutions to divest university funds from corporations with ties to Israel's military? You mentioned that, these efforts began around the turn of the millennium, that they've been going on for 19 years, that while there have been the passage of some of these resolutions, no university has divested. But her question specifically is, do you consider groups that promote BDS anti-Semitic?
Yeah, well, first of all, the very few resolutions that have passed have all been, as you pointed out, student resolutions. Nothing has, come from a board of a university or so forth. But I don't believe that they're inherently, anti-Semitic. The BDS, if you look at the promoters, the movers and shakers, they are, clearly anti-Zionists. They don't believe, Jewish self-determination and the right of the state. So if you see that as always being anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism, by the way, at its core, which I mentioned in the book and is in the definition, is seeing conspiracy theories about Jews trying to harm non-Jews and giving an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. So if you see anti-Zionism fitting into that, and then, you go from there to say, well, any type of BDS, because the movers and shakers of that anybody who supports it is also seeing that too. I think that's a problem, because there are people that support BDS because they don't like the occupation for other reasons. So I don't see it as anti-Semitic, because I don't see anti-Zionism as inherently anti-Semitic, although, as I explained before, it can be in certain circumstances. And that doesn't translate into somebody who's signing a divestment petition necessarily seeing something about Israel should no longer exist. It may just be about the occupation or other things. But you started off asking about the sort of each side sees the other as beyond the pale, and there's a lot of truth to that, and I think both sides are making it worse. On the one side, there's the sort of the pro-Palestinian side. There's the anti-normalization. We can't sit down and have a conversation with Israel supporters, because that would be the same as justifying all sorts of injustice and horrors. You wouldn't sit down with somebody who's that awful. And I think the Hillel frequently makes a mistake by saying it's not going to allow under the Hillel tent to bring in people like from Breaking the Silence or Jewish groups like If Not Now that have a view of Israel and Zionism that Hillel finds troubling, and I understand why they do. But to decide you're not going to allow that to happen under a Jewish tent, to me, is problematic, especially when there's evidence that some kids are feeling that when they cross the threshold at a university, they're being asked to go into one camp or the other, and they're saying, if that's the choice, I'm going to stay away from anything Jewish at all. And I think that's something that needs to be recognized. Finally, one thing that I do have in the book, and I don't want to make all this sound so glum, is that there are things using education to deal with a lot of these issues. And one example of a few that I gave at the end of the book, I think precisely gets to your point, Jonathan. I talk about this class that was, well, I'll tell you how I came across it. I saw a news story about this young woman named Amna Faruqi, who was a Pakistani Muslim young woman who became the president of J Street University, J Street U, kids group, J Street. And gee, that's an unusual fact. And I tracked it back, and she had taken a class with Paul Sham at University of Maryland. And I asked Paul, what was the class? And he said, well, it was developed by this woman named Natasha Gill. And it was looking at the conflict, Israel-Palestine, from the 1880s to the 1930s. So before the Holocaust, before the declaration of the state, before contemporary things. And half of the class had to be a simulation of the Peel Commission of 1936 and 37, when the Brits sent Lord Peel, what are we going to do with the mandate that we have? And he talked to everybody on all sides. And the students were given roles that were against type whenever possible, and had to faithfully represent one of the people that participated in the Peel Commission. Amna Faruqi was David Ben-Gurion for 6 or 8 weeks. She had to be inside his head and faithfully represent him. And when I talked to her, she said, as much of a, as funny as that might seem, she had an Israeli classmate who had to be the Mufti of Jerusalem. And as much as a difficult person he was in the context, the guy that was on her side, who was the Jabotinsky figure, was even worse. And when I tracked back to Natasha, who came up with this, she said, it's really interesting when I taught it, students would come into the class saying, gee, now we're going to figure out how the Israel-Palestine conflict should have been solved 80 years ago. And they come out of it saying, gee, now we know 80 some odd years after the Peel Commission why it still hasn't been settled. And that's the purpose of education. It doesn't necessarily convert people from, to Zionist to anti-Zionist. It makes them see this with a larger picture and uses the tools of education to do it.
So I want to ask this question from Susanna Heschel. She writes, is part of the problem with this, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit her question, is part of the problem with this debate on college campuses the link between Jewish donors and programs that one finds on campus? Can you name any major Jewish institutions or organizations that are committed to fostering intellectual and political debate? So your last example was about a professor who created a course that's been used in a number of different contexts in order to get students to think deeply and engage in historical empathy about what happened. Are there major Jewish institutions that are committed to precisely the idea of fostering debate around these issues?
I first of all, thanks, Susanna, for the question. I'm a great admirer of your work, as you know. The answer is, if there are any, I don't know of them. And I can tell you one of the challenges I had when I was running a small foundation, and I mentioned this in the book too, and I saw this, Natasha's course, and I thought, well, what a great thing. Let's get 20 professors together and train them how to teach this. And I started going to potential funders, and people were thinking about it, but nobody came through. And what I realized was that there was a problem on both sides. This was so contentious, right? So my guess is that even some people who thought this might be useful came down to thinking, am I going to get vilified for basically spending half of my money to teach the pro-Palestinian narrative? And then on the other side, there were concerns that, there were Palestinian folks that, am I going to get skewered for being seen as supporting something that is related to, Zionists? So the irony is that one of the potential cures to a degree as part of this problem suffers from the problem so deeply that we couldn't get the funding. I certainly hope that at some point, and that, there can be more things. I mean, obviously there are people that are supporting the ideas of liberal education, and I think that, I certainly hope that some will see this, but I could tell you that there's such, third rail implications from Jewish organization to be seen as somehow supporting something that's seen as critical to the basis of Israel's existence and Zionism, even to be seen as associated with that the risk isn't worth the reward, even if you think you're going to get. But look what happened to. I mean, we have lots of David Myers when he was at at the Center for Jewish. Lots of stories about how difficult that becomes in this climate.
Thank you so much. And I know we've got more questions in the chat. We are out of time today. We could have, this could have been a 2-3 hour event and we could have kept going. There is one last question that I think is important. And if you could kind of wrap us up with this
Sure.
in a way that makes sense for you. It says, assuming I fully agree with you on the definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to bring in one of my own questions to tie it in with this. But I noticed you keep referring to anti-Zionism as both equal. So he wants this, he, she.
I understand that. Anti-Semitism is equal to what?
So anti-Semitism. But my question is regarding the definition. Let me get back. I'm toggling here. I apologize. We seem to have a concept of Zionism, or many people seem to have a concept of Zionism that gets reduced to only one type, right, on college campuses or elsewhere, right, which is political Zionism. But there are so many different types of Zionism. We've got political Zionism and labor Zionism and revisionist and religious and cultural and diaspora, and probably more that I'm not even aware of. And so how important is that for us to understand all of these iterations of Zionism in terms of how it impacts our willingness to listen to one another?
I hope one of the things that people come away with from the book is that all these issues are incredibly complex, and that we're better served when we embrace that complexity, and as faculty and people associated with education teach that and model that, rather than trying to reduce things to simple terms. And my fear with the definitions is that they just become weapons. They become ways to beat up other people as opposed to examine those things. So yeah, I mean, I agree. There's lots of different ways we could spend more time talking about that as well, but about Zionism and different flavors of it. And some people are inside the Jewish tent who are anti-Zionists, like Satmars, but there's a pushback against some of the young kids who, if not now, who maybe from their theological views say, well, I can't square the concept of Zionism with how Judaism says to treat the stranger. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different levels on this, which is why when Kushner said in the executive order, our policy is anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop, why that's not either fair nor right nor smart for the Jewish community too. We should embrace the complexity. Finally, I want to say thank you all, and I know that there are more questions. I want to share with you all my email. If people want to email me, I'm happy to continue the conversation. It's kstern, so KSTERN at bard.edu, kstern at bard.edu. And thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm only sorry I couldn't be there in person.
And feel free to reach out to me. I know my contact information is on some of the publicity. If you didn't get a chance to write down that email address and you have some questions, I'm happy to connect you. But thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everybody, for coming today and listening and being here. And I hope that we can all move forward and continue having these conversations.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.